Hi, everyone. My name is Mags, and I'm your host on the Global Missions Podcast. On behalf of our team, I am so glad to welcome you to this bonus episode. This particular conversation will introduce you to a new initiative that we are really excited about. Whether you're new to the podcast or have joined us for any episode over the previous 6 seasons, we're honored that you've taken some time today to listen in and learn with us about God's global work. Today, we are going to lift the curtain on a project that I and several others on our team have been working on for the last few months. Maddy, who's been on the podcast team for some time, and she actually takes care of the show notes for this program, is going to join me today to talk about the Global Missions Toolbox. Maddy, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, I am so excited that we are finally at this point. Mm-hmm. Our listeners now don't usually get to hear your cheery voice because you serve behind the scenes. So before we get going, would you just take a minute and just share with the audience a quick sketch about yourself?
Yes, well, my name is Maddy. I am a recent business school graduate, and I have been working here at Send Canada for the last year or so, and it's just been great to have one of my main projects be the Global Missions Toolbox, which I am so excited to discuss today. I've been involved in my home church for many years, really for my whole life, just been plugged into my local church and excited about the ways the toolbox and my work at Send have all interacted with those ideas. So thanks for having me here today.
Well, we are really looking forward to this. And it's been a while. Well, let me ask you that. How long have you known about this toolbox project?
Yeah, really since day one of working at Send, the toolbox has been a big priority and conversation between Megs and myself. It's been a good year.
Now, Maddy is actually the team leader for the project, so I'm going to let her guide us through this brief conversation and overview. So, Maddy, where would you like to begin?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to begin by saying it's been wonderful to discuss and dream about this project in the last year or so. But Megs, it's been on your radar for a lot longer, and I think a lot of the vision and direction of this project has come from you. So I think it would be great if you start just by giving the listeners a bit of background on the Global Missions Toolbox and where this idea came from and why you think it is so important.
Sure. Okay. Well, I've got to say that I have been thinking and dreaming about this for at least the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine how excited I am that we finally reached this point. As I travel, though, across North America, most of my experience, of course, is in Canada, but there have been many similar conversations with friends in the United States. I just kept seeing a few things over and over again and trends. And unfortunately, they're not all happy trends, actually. Of course, the agency that I serve with, Send, also, it's just real challenging to be recruiting new workers. It's going very slowly, and that's a generalization, but it's true for other agencies we know as well. But I really was watching for trends in churches, and I'll mention 3. The first is I got a sense that classical mission agencies, like the one I serve with, were perceived as being present in churches or coming to churches just to extract resources from the church. That was not a welcome feeling. Pastors, missions committees, and church members, they just gave that sense, well, you're here to take away from us what is valuable and do what's important to you, mission agency, but what about us? That was the first one. The second one was agencies were sometimes considered inefficient, especially due to a perception that there were a lot of redundancies between agencies and that we're in many cases similar and we do a lot of the same things and we appear competitive with each other. And pastors would say, well, yeah, sure, your agency is here this week, but last week another agency was here and next week I know another one will be. And you guys are very similar and you're competing for resources. The last impression I was getting is just that we're old-fashioned. And it was thought that we're somewhat out of touch with what the church really needs. And so the bottom line was that pastors and missions committees were sometimes more annoyed by mission agencies than really helped. Not good.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely some challenges there. And Megs, you and I both work for a classical missions agency, and I think feel the weight of those realities in a similar way, maybe to how church leaders do. But recognizing those things and with your interaction in the church setting, what did you do about that? How do you work with that as being a part of missions agency?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing really was we decided to listen really well. Now, you're a business graduate, I know, Maddy, and we're not doing commerce in the same way most businesses are. We don't have a profit margin. But I would submit that we need to, and I could put this in quotes, I can't show it on the podcast, but we need to listen to our customers, if I could say it that way. And so I talked with pastors and missions committees across North America. Whenever I was invited to speak in a church, I actually asked, I'd like not only to speak to your church, but I'd like to meet with your missions committee. That was really the most important thing that we did along the way, I think.
Mm-hmm. And so, recognizing some of these challenges, a bit of a vision was born. And what does the solution look like from your perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I'll pick three things. We really wanted to focus on the senders. Now, those that listen to the podcast know this already. I talk about it a lot. The goers are the mission workers themselves who actually often move someplace. They are outward presenting the gospel in some mission context. The senders are people who are loving, sometimes financially supporting, praying for those workers. They are sending out the workers. And we wanted to build some resources that would provide real value for the senders while we continue to provide great services for goers. So the first was focus on the senders. The second was collecting practical tools. We feel like there's a lot of theory. There's a lot of hypothetical. And we do want to have good biblical starting points, of course, but we wanted usable tools that would really scratch the itches of people in small and medium-sized churches, especially. They indicated, well, we're having a challenge with our missions committee. So we looked at, well, how could we help strengthen missions committees? Or we're facing a challenge with our policy. We don't know how to rewrite this part of our policy. Well, here are some guide sheets on how you could rewrite that part of your policy. So practical tools. And the last piece really was we were committed to multi-agency. So while it's true that we serve with a mission agency, we are resisting the competition with other great agencies that are like-minded and are trying to get the gospel out to people who haven't heard and understood it. And so in response to that idea that you agencies are so similar, we just resist competition in spite of scarcity and commit to build something that everybody can use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've seen that multi-agency idea play out in really practical ways of just having a great group of people contributing to this. I'll mention our advisory group that has had representatives from different agencies as well as church backgrounds and people who serve on missions committees. And it's great to get all of those perspectives. And as we'll see throughout this conversation, really generous contributors who are part of giving tools that have worked in their context, whether an agency or a church, and could be helpful to other missions leaders within churches or senders really in any role. So Megs, as you think about the toolbox, could you summarize some of the goals? What do we hope to be outcomes for this project?
Right. Well, just two quick goals. The first is we need to get the gospel to the ends of the earth. It's part of the mission that Jesus gave to us when he returned to heaven. He said that we would be his witnesses in near places and medium places and faraway places. And so ultimately the goal is increasing and deepening engagement with global missions. The sub goal on the way to that is to really help churches that want to do a great job of global missions. And I mentioned before the size of churches. Sometimes big churches can afford to have someone on their staff that is dedicated full-time or part-time to missions. And our goal is to bring some of that capacity of a missions pastor, the resources and the experience to local churches that probably won't afford hiring that staff member. And we can bring that capacity to them through the toolbox. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is so helpful. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, let's turn this now. Let me ask some of the questions. We have said that we want to serve senders by providing practical tools, Maddy. Who do we have in mind when we say senders specifically?
Yeah, specifically, especially at this point, as the toolbox is launched, we are focusing on pastors, missions committees, and another group that we haven't got to discuss in much depth yet, but family and friends of mission
Mm,
workers. So, that first one just being the toolbox for pastors. And some of
right.
these tools are created and curated specifically with pastors in mind because there's such a unique and important role that they have in providing direction and leadership for their church. And what
Hmm.
the pastors are passionate and excited about often trickles down to church members, which we know is super important when it comes to the idea of missions and being involved, whether as a goer or a sender.
Well, I was just going to add, we've heard in podcast episodes just how critical the role of pastors is. And respectfully, we would say there is no single influencer with more authority and with more influence in the church than the pastor. Now, I'm stating the obvious, perhaps, but it also applies to global missions. And so that's why we're having this conversation about serving pastors.
Mhm.
But they face some challenges, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just of the daily responsibilities that a pastor has is pretty far reaching. And so there can be obviously so much busyness just in
Hmm.
what it takes on a day-to-day basis to lead a church.
Hmm.
And so we want the toolbox for pastors in particular to be especially practical and
Hmm.
actionable and be something that they can apply to their church context and give just a great starting point for their church. We
Hmm.
have talked about this so many times before, but we don't feel like we need to convince pastors that missions is important.
Right.
But we hope that with a tool that is created with them in mind and hopefully has worked really well in other church contexts, that they can start implementing some of the changes and goals that they have for their own church that will increase missional awareness and efforts within their congregation.
Yeah, that is so good. Well spoken. COVID hasn't helped for many pastors. It's
Mm.
just increased the complexity. Right now, what do we do and how do we do this? And it's really challenging for them. We want to always speak with great love and respect for the pastors that the Lord has provided for us. Let's go to specific examples here just quickly. Do you have a specific example of a resource for pastors from the toolbox that you would like to mention?
Yeah, we've talked about missions committees already, and
Hmm.
what a great way to involve people in your congregation in missions and really just be a great help and support to the pastor. But for churches where that's not already set up, one
Hmm.
resource I'm really excited about that is currently in the toolbox is a guide to starting a missions committee in your church. And that can be a great starting place for pastors. And this has been contributed by a missions agency here in North America called TEAM, so the Evangelical Alliance Mission, and it's just a great resource that can be found in the toolbox now.
Hmm. So just this will help illustrate it. This will be a download, right?
This is a PDF download. Yeah, just really helpful steps in place for pastors.
Super. And this is helpful too, I think, to note you didn't write this resource up, right, Maddie? This is not your invention.
No, no.
So just this idea that we didn't write all of this stuff, but really we are trying to comb through trustworthy resources and curate it, right?
Exactly.
We're the center point. That's really important here too. And we're glad to mention the contributors and shouts out. Well, there'll be a lot of shouts out, I think, to contributors along the way. Okay, so that's for pastors. That's the first group. What was the second group we want to serve?
The second group is missions committees, the toolbox for missions committees.
I got to say, I love missions committees. I love the people who are serving, and many times they are volunteers. And I just imagine, it's the first, whatever, Wednesday of the month, and they get together. Maybe it's on Zoom now. It used to be at the church, and put on a pot of coffee and they pray for missionaries and they think about missions policy and they plan out a missions conference and maybe a short-term mission trip. We love you and we know that you want to do a good job. And so we want to offer encouragement and ideas and resources and more networking so that you know that you're not alone. I find that missions committees don't talk to each other, Maddie. That was a consistent theme that we wrestle ourselves. Each committee wrestles ourselves with sometimes the very same issues as a church down the block or maybe across the province or the country. but has already wrestled with that. All right. Tools for missions committees. What do you have in mind here as a sample?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the tools for missions committees in particular is a list of questions to understand your church leaders' priorities. And I just think that can be so helpful for people who are often serving as volunteers, might not be directly in decision-making roles, but gives missions committee members a good starting point, whether that's asking some of these questions to a missions pastor in your church to give them a good idea of how they can best serve and execute those things, or the lead pastor, or maybe even elders within your church. Whatever your church context is, I think these questions can be so easily applied and just begin good conversations about what your church's goals and priorities for missions are. And so this was contributed by Ellen Livingood of Catalyst Services,
Yep.
and just a fantastic tool for missions committees.
Well, Ellen is a good friend and has been on the podcast a couple of times at least. She's served in missions herself. She's led missions committees, and she has now assembled a consulting type of ministry for churches. We'll have some notes at the end of this episode as well. We'll include the links there to Catalyst Services so that you can be acquainted with Ellen's excellent work. She is in the Pennsylvania area, so just over the border there. I'm glad you've chosen this resource, Maddy, to feature because it underlines our commitment to alignment. And this is speaking both to the committee and to the pastor. We don't want the pastors to go one direction or think one thing and the committees to think another. We want to help those align so that a pastor has every confidence that the missions committee is going in the direction that he understands and intends, and the missions committee has clarity from leadership too. So great first resource to highlight. Way to go. Who's the last group, the third group, Maddy?
Yeah, the third group that we are focusing on is family and friends. And this one is just family and friends of the goers, so the mission workers themselves. This group might seem different compared to the others because they're not necessarily in a leadership role at church, although they could be. But we also just think on a personal level, the family and friends and the close community on a relational level to mission workers have a really important role to play in sending. And so whether that's bringing encouragement or financial support or prayers, those are all roles that family and friends can play. As family and friends are sending mission workers in some context, they also have a call to live missionally where they are, even if that means staying at home. And so we wanted to focus on providing tools for this group of people as well, because it can just be such an encouragement and an important part in missions and in the role of sending.
That's really good. So you've chosen a specific resource to highlight just to illustrate here. What have you got?
Yeah, this one is specifically more for families. It's a PDF book called One Big Story by Weave. And it's really just a book of family devotions that walks through Bible stories as a family to help children discover God's purposes in his world. And I think of that in just such a great opportunity for people who are living at home, but living really intentionally and missionally and encouraging their children in what God's call on their life might be down the road. And also to help children understand why at church on Sunday, we sent this missionary, and what does missions mean anyways? And just really fantastic resource there that can be used in family contexts, whether you know a missionary very closely personally or just want to inspire that missional mindset in your children from a young age.
It's really good. Now, Maddy, I recently became a grandfather.
Yes.
You've met that little one. She is precious. Is this a book that would work for grandparents?
I think so. I think that would be a great opportunity for grandparents to use with their grandchildren.
Just putting some of those ideas out there, all of us who are investing in kids and helping them understand God's purposes in the world. Really good. So tools for pastors, tools for missions committees, and tools for family and friends, the senders. Now, some have wondered, Maddy, and Steve is on the line here too. Steve's our producer as he records this episode. People have wondered, how is the toolbox going to relate to this podcast that we've been doing? Now we've finished 6 seasons. This is season number 7 of the podcast. Is the podcast going away?
No,
It's not. And
absolutely.
we're really glad. Hey, Steve, you still have a job.
Good to hear. Good to hear.
Yeah. So we are going to continue to weave the podcast into the toolbox. And in fact, I see it this way sometimes. The podcast is going to be the voice of the toolbox. And we're going to refer back to previous episodes. We have over 160 episodes now in the podcast, and we're going to spring forward from that. Some of the resources are actually the resources that have been mentioned by our guests in previous and upcoming episodes. We're going to keep figuring that out and share more as we move forward. Mm-hmm. Okay, we got to wrap up here, Maddy, but let me ask this. For someone who's listening, maybe they're a missionary already, or maybe they're a sender, they are a pastor, or they serve on a missions committee, or they just know and love a missionary. They would like to use these tools. What are the next steps?
Yeah, well, one of probably the best next steps would be to go to our website, globalmissionstoolbox.com, and you can identify the group that you think you might fit best under. Maybe you're a pastor, and we encourage you to go to the pastor section or missions committee member or family or friend, whatever that might be, and register for the toolbox, and you'll have access to an online collection of resources curated specifically for your group. And yeah, just go browse through whether there's something in particular you're looking for, or something that just catches your eye as you're on the site. And yeah, realize that this is a growing collection of tools, and we hope it would be a great starting point for you now.
Now, some people might think right away, is this free?
Yeah, there is no subscription fee to the toolbox, and the majority of tools that are available now have been contributed by other organizations and are free. So there are lots of downloads, like some of the things that we've mentioned. Although there are some tools that we recommend and are excited to encourage you to use that do cost something. And so that would be within those other organizations that we might be pointing to.
Yep. And some of the things in the future, we just haven't got that all figured out. But people can sign up and learn about it and receive some of these tools and be able to move around the website, which is now live.
Yes.
What if somebody comes looking and they don't find what they're looking for, Maddy?
Yeah, that could totally happen. As I mentioned, this is growing and this is in the early stages of launching this project. But if you don't find what you're looking for, we would love to hear that. Perhaps you have a suggestion for a tool that we should add or a topic that should be covered. You can contact us on our website, or there's a page called Building the Toolbox, and maybe you want to submit a suggestion or something like that right there.
Great idea. And also, if somebody already has a resource, if you've got something that you think would really work well in the toolbox, what should someone in that situation do, Maddy?
Yeah, absolutely. We would love for you to consider becoming one of the contributors, and we would love to consider tools that have worked for you, your organization, or your church. And so the Building the Toolbox page on our website would be the right place to go if you would like to contribute a tool and offer that for review for our team.
Sounds great. Maddy, this has been a super introduction to the Global Missions Toolbox. I want to say thank you for all your work to take up the vision and to begin to flesh it out, bringing together the advisory group, bringing the podcast into it, bringing the Go Journal. That's another conversation. We'll have another day, the Go Journal part of the toolbox, and the website all ready to go. Thank you for all your work to coordinate this. Well done.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And congratulations for reaching this point. And thank you for coming right into this recording today and helping our audience understand this new resource, the Global Missions Toolbox.
Yeah, I've been happy to. Thanks for having me.
Well, I hope you find yourself sharing in our team's excitement and that you've enjoyed this bonus episode to introduce you to the Global Missions Toolbox. We invite you to take a couple of minutes now and stop by the new website and sign up to get access to this growing collection of tools. By the way, the website works really well on mobile as well, so you can see it on your phone and sign up there if you prefer to use that access point. If there's someone else you know who might benefit from this toolbox, please do pass it along. The address is really simple, globalmissionstoolbox.com. We really appreciate your helping to spread the word right around this launch time and sharing some of the excitement that our team is enjoying. I want to add a special invitation blended with an early word of thanks. This is a project that is not all figured out yet. We're seeking to actively build, a resource that will be genuinely useful to any church, any missions committee, any pastor. And that means that we need to hear from you what works, what doesn't, and what you might like to include next. We want to have your input and your feedback, so thanks for being part of this community. At this point, I'll say, thanks for joining us for this bonus episode of the Global Missions Podcast and for joining our team in the great adventure of helping make disciples of Jesus to the very ends of the earth.